This video is brought to you by the Logitech Lightspeed Wireless range of keyboards, mice and headsets, the benchmark in wireless gaming performance.
With the announcement of even more PlayStation exclusives coming to PC starting with Days Gone this spring, the time felt ripe to return to one of the first with Horizon Zero Dawn's PC version. At release, I was actually rather disappointed with the performance and user experience of this game's PC version. More than 6 months have now passed since then, and the game has seen multiple patches which have aimed to address complaints out of the community, and a number I originally mentioned in my first video. So in today's video, I will return to HCD to examine the performance and changes brought into the game's PC version since launch. Is now the time to finally jump in and grab this much lauded game on PC, or is it still in need of some dire improvements? Let's find out. First things first, when loading up the game, I immediately noticed that it displayed in a properly selected 4K, which the initial game did not do correctly, and instead displayed the game every boot in a downsampled 4K upscaled back up to 4K again. While in the menu, another change is immediately obvious, and that is the bottom lower right hand corner here where we can see the shader optimization or caching happening in real time. Initially, this game had a shader caching method where there was a very long loading screen that would happen for many minutes at a time, and your CPU would go to near full utilization and you'd have to just wait it out. Here it happens in the background in the menu while your CPU is being throttled, but now you can at least change the options as you see fit and even start the game before shader caching is done. While starting the game before shader caching is complete, I did not notice any particularly bad performance on an RTX 2080 Ti at my optimized settings at 70% resolution scaling from 4K, but at the same time, I would not necessarily start the game until shaders are cached. Just as a caution, because who knows what kind of problems it could involve. The rest of the menu options are not very different, but their function is. Exclusive full screen and borderless windowed mode now actually seem to work with no problems. Unlike the launch version, there does not seem to be an extremely large performance deficit by utilizing borderless versus exclusive full screen, and VSync as well looks to be working like VSync should. This plain functioning is not the case at all, where the launch version had borderless windowed mode running noticeably worse than full screen, and so this seems to be fixed up rather nicely. In terms of the options, there's a number of areas to discuss, as the options were less than stellar on the release for how they worked. The first was anisotropic filtering, which now actually works and does not require forcing anisotropic filtering from the graphics control panel anymore. So in-game, the low setting versus the ultra setting shows a marked difference like one would expect. A new aspect to these options is that changing a graphical option causes the game to seemingly momentarily pause while it's applied and the screen dims a bit, after which the option just saves and you can play the game again. I assume this pause is some sort of assurance that has been added in to make sure the shader does not mess up or have any performance or graphical issues. This new little pause is not a great nuisance, and it's much better than on release where there was many graphical errors that could show up when you would switch graphical options in real time. The second option to talk about is dynamic resolution scaling. At launch, this option overly aggressively downgraded resolution even when it was not necessary. Like here in the launch version where the game was just a tiny bit below 60 FPS at 4K ultra settings on an RTX 2080 Ti, and then with DRS on, DRS adjusted the scene resolution to 1080p to hit 60 FPS, which is obviously completely unnecessary. Now the DRS option seems to work like one expects it should. Here I turned it on and it dropped the resolution to just a tiny bit below native 4K to increase the performance up to 60 FPS like it should. So at least dynamic resolution scaling works now and is not overly aggressive, and I could recommend it as part of my optimized settings. Other options though are largely unchanged, hence how my optimized settings are the same as they are since launch. For example, at launch I thought SSAO was a bit bugged out at higher settings as the SSAO effect got higher resolution the higher you tuned it up, but it looked like the AAO radius, as it's called, did not scale with it. So higher settings at higher resolutions had less ambient occlusion. This still happens as of version 1.10 as far as I can tell, so I definitely still recommend the medium setting here for visuals and performance. So you have fixed options and most of the rest staying the same, but there's also a new one with Fidelity Effects Contrast Adaptive Sharpening, being able to be turned on when you utilize the game's TAA. This is the per usual sharpening filter from AMD, but I think it's a nice enhancement for those who want to increase contrast when using lower resolutions with TAA. So beyond SSAO being a bit strange, all the other settings now seem to work, and the game is so much more improved over launch in this regard. But issues were not just found in the menu with the options, as there were multiple visual artifacts in game. For example, one of the most glaring was the grass animation that they added to the PC version, which played back at a very odd looking 30 FPS that made the 60 FPS presentation in this game look stilted and not right. This is now changed as of the latest versions, where the current version of the game has grass animating at arbitrary frame rates. So at 60 FPS, like you can see here, or here, moving perfectly fine at 120 FPS, slowed down to half speed so you can see how it animates. Speaking of frame rates and animations, some physics, like Aloy's hair, did not animate correctly in the launch version at higher than 30 FPS. But as of now, if I put the capture of 30 and 60 FPS slowed down right next to each other, you can see that the hair physics looks rather similar. If there are differences here in the simulation, then they are rather small and do not at least look wildly different like they might have looked in the launch version, and they look rather normal. Another frame rate related issue at launch was the general awkwardness of the cutscenes at times at 60 FPS, as the game's cutscenes were not designed around it. One issue that would happen was that Aloy could warp around between camera shots visibly in an odd way, like here where the camera angle just changed and you can see Aloy teleporting back and forth. I'm exaggerating this here, of course, by slowing it down and reversing it constantly, but it did not look right. For this cutscene, now in the latest version, this no longer happens, and it no longer looks distracting and weird as Aloy does not teleport anymore. As I say that though, cutscenes still seem a little bit janky, but not because of issues like this, but because how they are actually across all versions of this game. This is not a unique problem to Horizon Zero Dawn, but it happens in many games where in between camera shots, character animation largely freezes, while other simulation aspects still go on, and the rest of the world elements render and update normally at 60 FPS. So each time a camera cut can occur, it looks like characters momentarily freeze, or as if the motion is not fluid. This is not a problem that only Horizon Zero Dawn has, as I've seen it in other AAA games actually, but it's now just so much more noticeable in Horizon Zero Dawn now that other technical issues are no longer visible in the latest version. Speaking of technical issues, the biggest one that caused me to want to tear my hair out at the game's launch was the game's stuttering. At launch, nearly every single camera angle change in every cutscene, nearly every single UI update, or just walking around the game world using the game's VSync would cause the game to have periodic stutters, both large and small, on any GPU or CPU hardware out there. Now the story is rather different. I went through the game just like back then, and I found noticeably less stutters at those exact same instances where they were reproducible every single time in the launch version. Back then, even with the GPU being criminally underutilized at a resolution like this with the RTX 2080 Ti, you could still see periodic stutters that would happen when a UI or cutscene camera would change. This new version seems much better in this regard based upon my testing, but that does not mean it's actually perfect. While the game seems to have far less frame time stutters than it had at launch, now there's something slightly different happening at times that can look visually similar. In the launch version, when UI would update, new frames could not be produced in that moment, and they would drop and you would see the same frame over multiple refreshes. This is a normal FPS or frame time stutter drop. Now in the new version, instead of doubling up frames by 2 or 3 when this happens, this doesn't happen now, so you have a flat frame time graph in the latest version. When I was playing this animation just now on screen, did you notice a slight weirdness when the UI updated? Yeah, I did too. It looked like a stutter, but it was not a frame time stutter that was measurable by any metric. Rather, there was a moment when the UI text popped up on screen, and the camera and animation motion in that moment when this UI updated seems to have hyper accelerated for a single frame, causing the motion of the camera and the animations from characters to move in a faster manner for one frame. The frames produced are unique and there's no frame drop, but the motion in them actually has a stutter. I noticed this a couple times on my playthrough and found it noticeable when it occurs, but it's perhaps less distracting than the old real frame time stuttering that occurred in the launch version. So the game is not exactly perfect, but it's better than launch, I would say. One last issue that I noticed in the current build is perhaps one that you can see as well when I just show this gameplay playing out here. Something look odd to you about this image? Well, look at the edges of it, the frame. There's a thin black line of a number of pixels width framing the real rendered image. I'm not sure when or why this black frame pops up, but it's an issue I read about online before, and I also encountered it while playing through this game's intro for this video. Other times it did not do this though. Beyond the stuttering concern, my initial video highlighted the general GPU performance problems that I encountered when playing this game, and I have generally great news here. Back at launch, I found Pascal performance in the mid-range to be absolutely atrocious. At my optimized settings, which were just slightly above console settings in terms of performance considerations, the GTX 1060 could be just above 30 FPS in gameplay, with even some stutter dips below. The RX 580 was faring a lot better, but at the same time, I could not shake the fact that at 1080p, that GPU was struggling to get 60 FPS at these moderately more expensive than console settings optimized settings I was using. Now let's look at the game as it is now on the GTX 1060. In the benchmark here, there's a 65% performance improvement that I measured versus my launch day performance recording. Now it is hitting heights above 60 FPS for most of the benchmark, where before it was struggling to be even near 40 FPS at times. If we go in the game itself, the initial opening cutscene performance is improved by a similar amount, with overall less dramatic stutters and frame time weirdness on camera transitions. They are still partially there here on the GTX 1060, but they do not manifest in nearly such a dramatic way on the frame time graph. So it's an improvement, but not exactly perfect. In gameplay though is where you see the biggest improvement, as the game at launch was barely 30 at times, but here, now as of the latest version, it's spending most of its time in the lower 50s with only a few rarer moments in the upper 40s briefly. These are really big gains on this older mid-range Pascal GPU. On AMD's side, things are less exciting when we look at the RX 580. In the benchmark, the lines are more or less the same, with minor differences that even out in terms of average frame rate over the course of the entire benchmark. So not very large differences here. The first cutscene in the game though shows much more interesting improvements, as the overall frame rate is slightly higher, but more importantly, the stutters on camera movements are almost completely eliminated on the RX 580 here versus launch, making cutscene playback so much more fluid. Using my in-game benchmark, we can see that the intro area of the benchmark runs quite a bit better in the new patch, but then differences between the two versions of the game even out more as the RX 580 in version 1.10 starts running a lot more like the launch version once you leave that one clearing area. So altogether, I see the GTX 1060 improving much from the launch version due to game updates or driver changes since then, while the RX 580 is more similar in performance to launch, but with much better cutscene playback. If we put the two old-timer GPUs back to back here, we can see how the GTX 1060 is now right there in the fight with the RX 580, with them being nearly even in performance, where the GTX 1060 at launch was getting pummeled by the RX 580. This is rather interesting, I think, as usually games like this have a clear winner for these GPUs, and I definitely would have expected AMD's GCN architecture like that found in the RX 580 to be showing its advantages here in this console-centric title. So here we're getting to the end of this update video covering Horizon Zero Dawn on PC. At launch, I was really genuinely frustrated with Horizon Zero Dawn's PC version. Settings did not work, visuals looked buggy, and performance was very inconsistent and filled with stutters. I found it grating on the eye to play, honestly. Now, much of the stuttering is eliminated. Key settings like VSync, windowed modes, dynamic res, anisotropic filtering work. And you can even avoid waiting on shader compilation should you so wish. The performance on Nvidia's side seems much improved, like we can see with the GTX 1060 performing more in line with where it usually does. So I definitely think Horizon Zero Dawn is much improved in its latest versions and has moved its category from a not good PC port to being an okay PC port. There are still some rough edges though, which keep it from being fantastic in my eyes, like the wonky cutscene camera change animation stalling, the rather odd animation playback jolt that can occur that has replaced some frame time stutters that we saw at launch, and the fact that I think the game is still underperforming on PC GPUs vis-a-vis the consoles. Even at console settings with bad anisotropic filtering, middling image quality at 1080p, the RX 580 with 6.17 teraflops of compute versus the 1.84 teraflops of compute of the PS4 cannot double that 30 FPS performance on console, even though it has more than 3 times the compute on a more advanced architecture. The performance in this game still doesn't seem exactly right to me based upon the usual differences we see between console versions and GPUs like this. Then again, this game was never originally destined for PC and is on an engine which was not designed around anything but the PlayStation 4. This is a different scenario from what we may see in Days Gone, which is Unreal Engine 4 and will probably by default, since it uses UE4, not have many of the problems that Horizon Zero Dawn had on PC at launch. So I really would not worry too much about Days Gone's PC port as a result. That is all I can really say for now though. Horizon Zero Dawn is much improved and probably worth a playthrough if you can manage the time and like these kind of open world games. I still hope Guerrilla Games can fix some of these nagging issues though. Anyway, if you did like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to see this video in the highest quality available, support Digital Foundry on Patreon to get this video and years worth of DF content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about Horizon Zero Dawn's PC version, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. So is this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.
A gaming icon evolved. Logitech's renowned G502 mouse joins the ranks of the world's most advanced gaming mice with the release of the G502 Lightspeed. Featuring ultra-fast wireless connectivity and reliability, with performance trusted in competition by esports pros. Featuring the next generation Hero 25K sensor and PowerPlay compatibility, this is the ultimate rendition of the celebrated G502 mouse.